The furnace clicked off sometime around 2 in the morning, and the house went quiet in that particular way it does in January in Ontario. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that presses against your ears. I had been sitting at the kitchen table for maybe 20 minutes before I realized I hadn't moved. The mug in front of me had gone cold. On the table, held flat by the sugar bowl, was a piece of paper torn from the notepad my daughter kept by the phone, her handwriting. 11 words. "We've gone to Vancouver. The house is yours. Don't call." I read it 3 times. Then I set it down and looked at the window above the sink, the one that faces the backyard. Snow was coming down again. Slow, in different flakes. The kind that don't seem to fall so much as just appear, as if they've always been there and you only just noticed. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the furnace to kick back on, long enough for the sky to shift from black to that particular gray-blue that passes for dawn in winter. Then I got up, poured the cold coffee into the sink, and made a fresh pot. My daughter Renee was 41 when she got married. I was 63 at the time, recently retired from 31 years with the Ontario Power Generation, and living alone in the house in Barrie that her mother and I had bought in 1987. Her mother, Beverly, had passed 4 years earlier, ovarian cancer, quick and brutal, and I had rattled around in those 1,400 square feet longer than was probably good for me. When Renee called to say she was engaged, I was genuinely happy for her. She'd had a hard decade, a first marriage in her early 30s that lasted less than 2 years, a period after that where she seemed more interested in working than in anything else. Then she met Dale at some work conference in Toronto. He was in logistics, she was in HR, and within 8 months they were talking about a future together. I met Dale twice before the wedding. Once at a dinner at a restaurant on Dunlop Street, once at the wedding itself. He was polite, firm handshake, asked me about hockey, which I appreciated, though I got the sense he'd been coached to ask. He had a good laugh. I remember thinking he laughed easily, maybe a little too easily, the way some people do when they're trying to make a room comfortable without actually offering anything of themselves. Renee seemed happy. That was the main thing. She had always been a serious person. Even as a child, she thought before she spoke, which Beverly always said was a gift, but which sometimes felt like a wall, and around Dale she seemed lighter, less guarded. I told myself that was enough. The wedding was in September, small, at a vineyard near Niagara-on-the-Lake. 40 people. Renee wore her mother's pearl earrings. I walked her down the grass between the chairs and she held my arm very tightly and didn't say anything, and I didn't either, and that was probably the last time things felt simple between us. They moved into a house in Mississauga, a semi-detached on a quiet street near the Credit River. Within a year, Dale had left his job in logistics. There had been some kind of restructuring, he said. He was taking time to figure out his next move. The time stretched out. He was particular about things, the way groceries were organized, which shows they watched, and in what order. When Renee mentioned during a phone call that she'd signed up for a pottery class on Wednesday evenings, he apparently went quiet for the rest of the night. She told me this in a way that made it sound like an observation, not a complaint. I filed it away and said nothing. 6 months after the wedding, they asked if I would consider helping with the mortgage. Just temporarily, Renee said. Dale was between things. Once he landed somewhere, they'd sort it out properly. It wasn't a huge amount, a few $100s a month to cover the gap. I had the pension, the savings, the house in Barrie that was paid off. I said yes. A year later, the ask got larger. Dale had started a small business importing some kind of fitness equipment from manufacturers in Winnipeg and reselling it through a website. The margins weren't there yet, he said. The credit line was getting tight. Could I increase the monthly amount just until the business found its footing? I said yes again. I should tell you that I am not a man who gives money easily. Beverly would have agreed with that, and probably not entirely as a compliment. I grew up in a household in Sudbury where my father worked at the smelter and money was a thing you didn't discuss, except in terms of what you didn't have. I put myself through college, worked summers on road crews in northern Ontario, and spent my entire career at a job that had nothing glamorous about it but paid steadily and had a pension that I'd earned. I was not reckless, I was not soft. But she was my daughter, and she was all I had left of Beverly really, in the way that a child carries both parents in them, whether they mean to or not. When Renee laughed at something, she tipped her head sideways exactly the way her mother did. I couldn't explain to anyone why that made me write the checks. I'm not sure I fully understood it myself. The business went nowhere. By the end of their second year of marriage, Dale had pivoted to something else. Online consulting of some vague kind, helping small businesses with their digital presence, which as far as I could tell meant charging people to set up social media pages they didn't need. He drove a newer truck than mine. He replaced their living room furniture. He talked about the business with a confidence that had no connection to any result I could observe. I started visiting on weekends, partly to see Renee, and partly, I'll admit, because I wanted to understand where the money was going. The house was fine, well kept, nothing extravagant. Dale was always civil to me. He called me by my first name, Alec, which I hadn't specifically invited, but which I didn't object to. He asked my opinions on things and then didn't listen to the answers, which is a particular social skill that I've noticed in a certain kind of man. What I noticed more was Renee. She had started to shrink in a way that's hard to describe, not physically, but she stopped finishing sentences when Dale was in the room. She'd start to say something at dinner and then glance at him and trail off. She laughed at his jokes a half second after she should have, the way you laugh when you're not sure if something is a joke. When I asked her how she was, just the two of us in the kitchen while Dale watched television, she'd say, "Fine," and mean it in that exhausted way that means anything but. I didn't say anything. I don't know why exactly. Partly because I wasn't certain enough. Partly because she hadn't asked. Partly because she hadn't asked. Partly because I was 65 years old and had learned that people hear advice as interference unless they've specifically requested it, and even then, sometimes. And partly, I think, because I was afraid of what she'd say if I asked directly, that she'd have to make a choice she wasn't ready to make, that things would break before she had anywhere solid to stand. So I kept showing up on weekends, kept putting money into the account they shared, kept telling myself that being present was enough. It wasn't enough, but I didn't know that yet. The third year of their marriage, Dale's parents retired and moved from Calgary to a condo in Mississauga, 20 minutes from the house on the Credit River. His mother, a trim woman with an opinion about everything, began appearing at the house on weekday mornings. I learned this from the occasional comment Renee made. Things like, "She stopped by again," delivered in a flat voice that told me everything I needed to know about her feelings, but nothing about what she was doing about them. His father was a quieter man, seemed decent enough, though he and I shared no particular common ground. What I remember most about both of them was the way they treated the house as an extension of their household. The way they'd reorganize things in Renee's kitchen without being asked. The way Dale's mother once told me at Sunday dinner that she'd been advising Renee on how to manage her schedule. Said it like a kindness, looked at me while she said it like a challenge. I smiled and cut my roast beef. But things were shifting. I could feel it at the table, the way Dale deferred to his mother in small, constant ways. The way Renee sat at her own dinner table like a guest. The the way my chair, the one at the left end, which had always been mine when I visited, had started to get moved to the side, closer to the wall. Not dramatically, just a few inches, as if to make room for something, or to make a point too small to argue with. Around this time, the monthly contributions increased again. The credit line had grown. Dale explained this with charts on his phone that I didn't fully follow. He used phrases like cash flow timing and Q4 runway, and looked at me the way people look at you when they want you to feel included without actually including you. I said I'd think about it. That evening, driving back up the 400 toward Barrie, I did something I hadn't done in a while. I pulled into the Tim Hortons at the Cookstown exit, got a large coffee, sat in the parking lot, and did the math on a napkin. Not symbolic math. Actual numbers. What I'd given over 3 years. What it had cost me in savings, in flexibility, in the retirement Beverly and I had planned that now existed only in the folder of travel brochures she'd kept in the desk drawer that I still hadn't thrown away. The number surprised me, not because it was outrageous, but because I had let it creep up so slowly that I'd never had to confront it all at once. I drove home, went to bed, and didn't call the next day to say yes. 3 weeks passed. Then Renee called. I expected her to ask about the money. Instead, she said she wanted to talk about something else. She said it in that careful way she had, the one that meant she'd been rehearsing. She said that Dale and she had been discussing the future, and that they both felt I had been a tremendous help, and that they wanted to put things on a more formal footing. They were going to refinance the mortgage, and they were wondering if I would consider co-signing, given my credit history and the pension income, which would help them get a better rate. I held the phone for a moment. The furnace clicked. I said, "Renee, I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Are you happy?" There was a pause, a long one. She said, "Dad, that's not what we're talking about." I said, "I know. I'm asking anyway." Another pause. Then she said, "I'm fine." It was the same fine, the exhausted one. I said I'd think about the co-signing. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I think she knew from the way I said it that the answer was probably no, because she didn't push and she didn't call again for almost 2 weeks, which was unusual. That autumn, I drove down to Mississauga on a Saturday in October to take Renee to lunch, just the two of us the way we used to when she was in her 20s, and I'd drive down to Toronto on a Saturday, and we'd walk along the waterfront and eat somewhere and talk. She had said yes to lunch easily, almost eagerly, which made me think she needed it as much as I did. We went to a place she liked near the river. She had a sandwich, I had soup. Outside, the leaves were doing what they do in Ontario in October, that fierce, brief beauty that always feels like a last statement before everything goes gray. We talked about small things for a while. My house, her cousin's new baby, the state of the Leafs, which is always a reliable subject for mild shared despair. And then, somewhere around the middle of the meal, she set down her fork and looked at me and said, "Dad, I know you're worried." I said, "Tell me what's actually going on." She took a breath and told me. Not everything, maybe, but more than she'd said in 3 years. That Dale's business had never made real money. That there were debts she hadn't known about until recently. Debts that predated their marriage. That his mother had been pressuring her to access her own RRSP savings, which she hadn't done yet, but the pressure was there, steady and unspoken like weather. That she had started keeping a separate savings account that Dale didn't know about, something she'd read about online, something she said with a kind of careful shame, like she was confessing to something that was actually a sensible precaution. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I said, "You don't have to protect him to me. You never did." She looked at the window. October light on her face, her mother's earrings in her ears, small gold ones today, not the pearls but something close. She said, "I just didn't want you to think I'd made a mistake." I said, "I think you married someone who turned out to be different than you thought. That's not a mistake, that's just what happened." She nodded. We sat quietly for a while. The restaurant moved around us. Somewhere behind us a child was asking for ketchup. On the drive home, I thought about Beverly. I thought about what she would have said, which was probably something clear and unafraid that I would have needed 2 days to get to on my own. I thought about the money. I thought about what it means to help someone and what it means to enable something, and how much of what I'd done over 3 years had been which. I stopped the monthly contributions the following week. I didn't make a speech about it. I just let the transfer lapse and sent Renee a brief email that said, "I'll always be here for you personally. But I'm not in a position to continue financially. Let me know if you want to talk." She didn't respond for 4 days. When she did respond, it wasn't Renee. I received an email from Dale, his name in the sender field, though the tone felt collaborative, the kind of email that's been read and adjusted before sending. He wrote that he understood times were difficult for everyone, but that the decision to withdraw support without notice had created a hardship, that there were obligations already in motion, that he had hoped for more communication. He used the word family 4 times. He did not ask how I was. I read it once. Then I closed the laptop and watched the news. 2 days later, a follow-up. This one from Dale's mother copied to Renee. It was longer. It covered the refinancing that hadn't happened, the line of credit, the pressure of the market. She had looked up house prices on the credit River Street, apparently, and included this information, and it suggested, not quite directly, but clearly enough, that a parent who truly cared about their child's stability would not withdraw in this way. I sat with that one for a while. Then I wrote back a single paragraph. I said I appreciated the context, that I had thought carefully about my decision, and that I would be addressing any further concerns directly with my daughter. I did not copy anyone. I pressed send. I called Renee that evening. She answered, which I hadn't been certain she would. She sounded tired and a little guarded, but she stayed on the phone. I told her I loved her. I told her I would always be her father. I told her that anything I had done financially in the past 3 years had been for her, not for anything else, and that it wasn't a debt she owed me. It was just what you do for your child. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I know, Dad." I said, "Do you?" She said, "Yes, I know." The months that followed were uneven. There were weeks where she called regularly, and we talked the way we used to. Long calls about nothing particular, the kind that feel like company. There were other weeks where I'd leave a message and hear nothing for 10 days. I tried not to read too much into the silences. I tried to hold whatever she was navigating with open hands instead of tight ones. In February, she called to tell me she had spoken to a lawyer. She had used the money from the separate savings account to pay for the initial consultation. She was not sure yet what she was going to do, but she had wanted to understand our options regarding the house, the debts, the division of what they had built and what had been borrowed. I said, "That sounds like a very sensible thing to do." She said, "The lawyer said I should have done it sooner." I said, "That might be true, but you're doing it now." She cried a little then, not a lot. Just a few seconds, the way she sometimes did when she'd been holding something for a long time, and something small finally tipped it. I stayed on the phone and didn't say anything useful and didn't try to. The note on the kitchen table, those 11 words in January, 2 years after that October lunch. I had driven down on a Friday after a phone call that felt off. She'd been cheerful in a pressured way. that particular brightness people use when they're managing something. I arrived in the early evening, let myself in with the key I still had, called out, and heard nothing. The lights were on in the kitchen. On the counter, 2 coffee mugs in the drying rack. In the living room, some of the furniture was gone, the gaps in the bookshelf standing out like missing teeth. And on the kitchen table, under the sugar bowl, that piece of paper. "We've gone to Vancouver. The house is yours. Don't call." Renee's handwriting. But those weren't her words. I knew her words. I'd known them for 41 years. Those were someone else's words written in her hand. And that distinction mattered to me in a way I couldn't entirely explain and still can't. I sat down at the table. The furnace clicked off. Snow came down past the window. I thought about Beverly the way I do when I need to think clearly, because she always helped me find the thing underneath the thing. I thought about what Renee had told me that October, the separate account, the lawyer, the slow understanding that had been building in her for years. I thought about whether gone to Vancouver was an escape or a surrender, and which one she needed it to be, and whether those were even different. After the sun came up, pale and thin, the way it is in January, I made some calls. I called the lawyer whose name Renee had mentioned, explained the situation, and asked what I needed to know about the house, which was in Renee's name, purchased before the marriage. The lawyer walked me through it calmly. Renee's rights were clearer than she might have been led to believe. I called my own bank and spoke to someone about what I had been contributing and whether any of it could be characterized in a useful way. It couldn't really. It had been informal. But the conversation clarified things. I did not call Dale. I did not respond to the note. 3 days later, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize, but an area code I associated with Mississauga. It was Dale's mother. She began speaking before I could say anything, a practiced efficiency to it, and I waited until there was a pause, and then I said, "I'd like to speak with my daughter, please." There was a silence. Then she said Renee wasn't available. I said, "Then I'll wait." She said, "I don't think you understand the situation." I said, "I think I understand it fairly well." She said, "Renee has made her decision." I said, "Has she? I'd like to hear that from her." She said a few more things. I stayed quiet through most of them. At a certain point the call ended, though I couldn't have told you which of us put down the phone first. Renee called me from Vancouver 6 days after the note. She was at an airport hotel. She had been staying with Dale's cousin, she said, which was not where she had wanted to be. Her voice was careful but not dead, which I took as significant. She asked how I was. I told her honestly, fine, tired, that I'd called a lawyer, that she should know what the house situation actually was. She was quiet when I said that. Then she said, "I already know. I talked to my lawyer." I said, "Good." She said, "Dale keeps saying you poisoned me against him." I said, "What do you think?" She said, "I think I just finally stopped pretending I didn't know what I knew." I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "That's the bravest thing I've ever heard you say, and I've heard you say some brave things." She laughed a little. The sideways tip was in it, her mother's laugh. I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't known was gripped. She came back to Ontario in March. Not back to the house on the Credit River, but to a rented apartment in Guelph, close enough to Barrie that I could drive down for dinner on weekdays if either of us felt like it, which we did, more often than not. The separation took most of a year to formalize, the way these things do in Ontario, when there are assets in dispute, and one party is not cooperative. The house eventually went back to Renee, legally and clearly, which the lawyer had said from the beginning was the most likely outcome. Dale moved in with his parents. His business, as far as I could tell, continued to generate more explanations than revenue. I didn't recover what I'd contributed financially, not in any formal sense. I hadn't expected to. The money was gone, and I'd made peace with that somewhere around January, sitting at that kitchen table with a cold mug and 11 words. What I got back was something I hadn't known I was at risk of losing. The ability to have a real conversation with my daughter. The kind where she finishes her sentences. Where she disagrees with me about small things the way she always used to. Where she calls me on a Wednesday evening just because she saw something on the news that reminded her of an argument we'd had 15 years ago. Last October, we went back to the restaurant near the Credit River. Same table, more or less. She had the same sandwich. I had the soup. The leaves were doing the October thing again, that last fierce color before everything quiets. She asked me if I regretted helping them financially all those years. I thought about it honestly. I said I regret some of the later amounts I think I was paying to avoid a harder conversation. That wasn't fair to you. She looked at the window. Then she said, I think I needed you to stop before I could start. We sat with that for a while. On the drive back up the 400, I stopped at the Cookstown Tim Hortons, same as I had years before, and got a large coffee, and sat in the parking lot and looked at the November sky going dark over the flat Ontario fields. I didn't do any math. I didn't need to. I just sat there and drank my coffee while it was still hot, which felt, all things considered, like enough. There is a particular kind of cold that has nothing to do with the weather. I felt it sitting at that kitchen table in Mississauga in January, reading 11 words in my daughter's handwriting that weren't really her words at all. And the strange thing is, I'd felt a version of that cold for 3 years before that night. I just hadn't let myself name it. When I look back at what happened between Renee and Dale, and between Renee and me, I don't see a story about one bad person and one good one. I see something more ordinary and more painful than that. I see what happens when people slowly stop being honest with each other and with themselves. Dale wasn't honest about the debt he brought into the marriage. Renee wasn't honest with herself or with me about what she could see happening. And I wasn't honest either, not really, when I kept writing those checks and told myself it was love rather than avoidance. What I've learned at 66 years old is that doing the right thing and doing the comfortable thing are rarely the same action. I kept contributing financially long past the point where it made sense, not because I had assessed the situation clearly and decided it was the correct choice, but because I didn't want to have a hard conversation with my daughter. That's not generosity. That's something closer to cowardice dressed up in a father's clothing. The money wasn't the problem. The silence I was buying with it was. Renee had to develop something I can only describe as a kind of earned clarity. It didn't come to her quickly. It came through years of small moments where she noticed something, filed it away, and chose not to look directly at it. And then one October afternoon at a restaurant by the Credit River, she looked directly at it. That took real courage. Not the loud kind, not the kind that makes a scene, but the quieter kind that comes from deciding you'd rather know the truth than maintain a comfortable uncertainty. I was proud of her that day in a way I hadn't expected. What I've tried to carry forward is this, that the most useful thing I could offer Renee wasn't money, and it wasn't even advice. It was the discipline to ask an honest question when everyone in the room was pretending the question didn't exist. Are you happy? 2 words that changed the shape of the next 2 years. Not because they fixed anything immediately, but because they made it harder for either of us to keep pretending. The furniture gaps in that living room, the 11 words on the notepad paper, those weren't the beginning of something going wrong. They were the end of something that had been going wrong for a long time. By the time I sat at that table in January, the hardest work had already been done quietly, in phone calls and a separate savings account and one appointment with a lawyer. Renee had been building her way out long before she left. I just had to be steady enough and honest enough with myself to let her find her own footing without pulling her back toward my comfort. She called me from that airport hotel in Vancouver and said, "I think I just finally stopped pretending I didn't know what I knew." I've thought about that sentence a lot since then. It seems to me that most of the real turning points in a life come down to exactly that. The moment when what you know and what you're willing to act on finally close the distance between them. The coffee at the Cookstown Tim Hortons tastes the same as it always has. That feels like something worth holding on to.